My name is Amelia. I'm 36, and I never imagined that what seemed like a warm family reunion would almost land my husband and our 3 kids in jail. That day was supposed to be nothing more than a simple road trip, hot coffee in the front seat, cookie crumbs in the back, and the kids dozing off against their animal-shaped neck pillows. But just a few miles before the border, Grant, my husband, suddenly said, in a voice so quiet it chilled me, "Turn the car around." Now. I still remember the look in his eyes. Not panic. Not anger. Just a deep, suffocating certainty. And I listened, not because I understood, but because for the first time in my life, I felt like he was trying to save us from something bigger than I could comprehend. Before I tell you what was really inside the red duffel bag my parents had me carry across the border, leave a comment if you've ever had your trust used against you by your own family, and hit like if you've ever stayed silent, thinking it was the right thing to do. I had no idea where I was turning. But I knew, if we kept going straight, my family would never return home the same. We were on the highway, just a little over 30 minutes from the Canadian border. The kids were slumped lazily in the back seat, their heads resting on stuffed animal neck pillows, half asleep. The back was a mess of cookie crumbs, juice boxes, and worn-out travel toys. Up front, it was me and Grant, and a cup of coffee still warm in the holder. I was just thinking about what playlist to put on when Grant, without turning to me, said in a voice low and sharp as a blade, "Turn the car around. Right now." I froze. What? He still didn't look at me. His voice dropped even lower, but somehow it hit harder. "Please. Turn around. I'm begging you." I had never seen Grant like that. He's always been calm to the point of detachment, unshakable, almost frustratingly indifferent during conflicts. But his eyes in that moment, they weren't panicked. They weren't angry. They were filled with a kind of breathless certainty. As if whatever lay ahead wasn't just wrong, but irreversible if we crossed it. I turned the wheel, my hands trembling ever so slightly. We exited the highway at the last possible turnoff. The frame of the car gave a soft jolt, as if even it knew we had just veered into something else entirely. A direction that wasn't on Google Maps. The thin trees lining the road slipped past the window like silent witnesses to a decision no one would ever see, but that would change everything. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of my youngest, asleep with her head resting on her brother's shoulder. Her cheeks were flushed, her mouth slightly open, peaceful in a way that hurt. I wondered, how many kids grow up never knowing what their parents quietly saved them from? The road narrowed into a shadowy dirt path, covered in damp, rotting leaves. It was tight and dim, almost like it didn't lead anywhere at all. I stopped the car. Killed the engine. And for a moment, the world went still, just the rustle of leaves and the wind slipping through a cracked window. "Are you going to tell me what's going on now?" I asked, my voice dry as dust. Grant turned to me, for the first time since he asked me to turn back. His voice was barely above a whisper, but each word hit like a drumbeat in my chest. "You don't need to know the reason yet. You just need to trust me, just this once." I didn't understand. I truly didn't. But in that moment, for the first time in my life, I realized, sometimes, we don't need to know everything to make the right choice. I nodded. And let him step out of the car. I stayed behind the wheel, the air feeling heavy as lead. He walked around to the back. Popped the trunk. Sunlight filtered through the trees, catching motes of dust as they hovered midair. I heard a soft click. Then silence. I didn't yet know what was waiting for me back there. But my gut told me one thing, with terrifying clarity. My life was about to change forever. I stepped out of the car, my feet crunching down on dry leaves and loose gravel. The faint morning light filtered through the trees, casting thin golden lines across the car's body and the shoulder of Grant's jacket. He was standing at the back, one hand resting gently on the trunk, like he was still deciding whether to open it. I walked toward him slowly. In that moment, the world seemed to slow down, no traffic, no kids giggling, just heavy breaths and a vague dread crawling through my veins. Whatever we were about to see, there would be no going back. Grant said nothing. He opened the trunk. In the dim shadow of the cargo space, the red bag appeared, plain, familiar, crumpled from being wedged between pillows and other luggage. I recognized it instantly. An old sports bag. My parents had used it for tennis shoes, then picnic gear, then swimsuits. Nothing unusual until Grant bent down and unzipped it. I didn't have time to stop him. The first layer was a hoodie. Normal. Then some underwear, thrown in hastily. And then, a clear plastic Ziploc bag emerged. Inside were small white packages, tightly compressed and sealed with thick tape. I froze. 3 more bags. Identical. Barely hidden, anyone opening the trunk and looking closely would have seen them. I could hear myself breathing hard. It wasn't fear, it was full-body paralysis. Like my mind couldn't convince my body that what I was seeing was real. I couldn't speak. But Grant stayed calm. He just looked at me, and for the first time, I understood he had suspected this all along. With 3 kids in the front seat, I whispered, my voice no longer sounding like my own, they put my entire family on the line, for a few $1,000s? Grant nodded slowly, as if trying not to break me completely. I wasn't 100% sure until I opened it, he said. But the way they looked when they handed it to us. It wasn't normal. It was like everything had already been arranged. Like they knew we wouldn't check. I sank down to the side of the road, both hands gripping my head. A wave of nausea crashed over me, pulling with it a storm of memories, my mother's smile as she shoved the bag into my hands, my father's voice saying just some random stuff, and me, someone who always thought of herself as clear-headed, rational, someone who knew how to set boundaries. Turns out I was just an obedient fool. A well-trained daughter, programmed to follow orders even when those orders could destroy everything. Grant zipped the bag shut, saying nothing more. He didn't need to. That silence held more weight than any accusation. In his eyes, there was no anger. Only pain. I looked toward the car. Our youngest was still fast asleep, arms around her green dinosaur neck pillow. The older 2 were watching cartoons, completely unaware they'd just narrowly escaped something that could have destroyed it all. My entire family, just miles away from prison. I broke down. No screaming. No thrashing. Just tears I couldn't hold back, as if my body itself was mourning a trust that had just died. Then I took a deep breath. We couldn't sit there forever. I knew that. Grant knew that. But we needed a few more minutes to absorb the truth. To silently say goodbye to the image of a family I once believed was trustworthy. I whispered, mostly to myself. They never thought I'd check. Because I never dared to doubt them. And that's exactly why they chose me. Because they knew I still loved them. I used to think I was a good daughter. Never rebellious, never caused my parents trouble. Always cleaned up after myself, studied hard, and stayed polite during every family gathering. My mother used to proudly tell the neighbors, Amelia is the kind of daughter who understands the first time you say something. When I was little, I thought that was the highest compliment in the world. But sitting there in that desolate forest, after seeing the Ziploc bags full of illegal substances my own parents had stashed, I began to wonder, was that really a compliment, or proof that I'd been programmed to obey? I remembered moments that once felt harmless, like the time I cried because I didn't want to go to my uncle's house for Thanksgiving, and my mother said, "Grown-ups have their reasons. You just need to listen." I never asked twice. I never questioned why I wasn't allowed to choose my own feelings. I learned to stay silent and called it maturity. I remembered one night when I was 15. I had lost an old necklace that belonged to my grandmother, the only piece of jewelry my father had kept after she passed. I panicked, sobbed uncontrollably, and he just sat there in silence. When I finally bowed my head and apologized, he replied coldly, "You didn't lose the necklace. You lost my trust." From that day on, I became someone who constantly tried to earn back trust by doing everything right. Don't disturb. Don't push back. Every rebellion only lived in my mind, then vanished before turning into action. I called it growing up. But now, faced with the truth that my own parents had put my children's lives at risk, I felt like a robot just waking up after 30 years of programming. I don't know exactly when in my life I started confusing obedience with love. Maybe it was when I was 10 and took a beating for something my sister did, because older sisters have to know how to give in. Maybe it was when I was 22 and my mom called me home to take care of my sick grandmother, right in the week I was supposed to present my thesis. I came home. I always came home. Looking back now, I don't blame my parents for putting those packages in the bag. I blame myself for being too good to question it. And that's what hurt the most. Not the betrayal, but the fact that I had collaborated with that betrayal through my own obedience. In the car, Grant stayed silent. He didn't push me to speak. We just sat next to each other, letting the pain pour over us like a salty summer storm. I turned to him and whispered, "Do you think they ever truly loved me?" Grant looked at me for a long time, then answered, "I think they loved the version of you that you created to be accepted. But, honey, you don't have to live like that anymore." That sentence dropped into my chest like a stone, heavy, but freeing. Maybe I'm no longer the good daughter they once wanted. But for the first time, I felt like I was truly alive. I adjusted the rearview mirror. The kids were still peaceful. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose the future my children would grow up in. I sighed, then placed my hands on the steering wheel. "We can't go back," I said. "But at least, we know the road not to take again." I didn't call back right away. I didn't text. I let the phone keep buzzing in the glove compartment, as if the ringing might just dissolve into the trees and disappear. My parents were waiting for me at Aunt Kathy's house, about 2 hours from the border crossing. We had planned to meet there for dinner. The whole family would be there, cousins, nieces, nephews. Aunt Kathy loved throwing noisy family gatherings. But this time, I wouldn't be coming. I sat still in the car, where the late afternoon sun slanted through the window and fell across my youngest daughter's sleeping face. I watched her tiny hand curl as she shifted slightly. And in that moment, a truth hit me with crystal clarity. If I showed up, if I kept pretending nothing had happened, I would be teaching my children what I had once been taught, that loyalty matters more than right or wrong. I couldn't do that. Not again. When I unlocked my phone, there were 7 missed calls from my mom, 3 text messages, and 1 voicemail. I wasn't ready to listen. But I opened the texts. The first one read, "Are you almost here? Everyone's waiting." The second, "Your dad is wondering what's taking so long. Is everything okay?" And the last one, like a dagger, Don't disappoint your father. That sentence, seemingly harmless, hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd heard it 100 times. Before every competition, every exam, every big decision. This time, it wasn't a reminder. It was a chain. I had spent my entire life trying not to disappoint my father. And I had traded everything to do it, even the truth. Grant turned to me, his eyes gentle but steady. "You can call them," he said. "But you don't owe anyone an explanation." I nodded. But my throat tightened as I hit dial. Mom picked up almost immediately. Her voice still sweet, as if nothing had changed. "Oh, Amelia. Everyone's waiting. Your dad was just about to call again." I bit my lip. "I'm not coming." Silence. A beat. Then her voice dropped. "What are you talking about?" I kept my voice as calm as I could. "I can't pretend nothing happened. I need time to process. And to protect the kids." Another silence. Longer this time. "Amelia, don't blow this out of proportion. It was just a few harmless things. You're letting Grant twist everything." I looked over at Grant. He said nothing, but those eyes, quiet and grounded, gave me strength. "Mom," I said, for the first time without trembling in my voice. "I don't think I'm blowing things up. I think I'm finally seeing them for what they really are." This time, it was my mother who hung up first. I sat there for a long time after that. No tears. No shaking. Just hollow, like I had done something terrible, committed some unthinkable crime, all because I said no. I had never realized this before. When you grow up in a toxic family, saying no can make you feel like a criminal. But when I turned to look at my kids, I knew I had done the right thing. I adjusted my daughter's seatbelt, then looked at Grant. "Let's go," I said. We pulled away from that dirt road, not to run, but to begin again. From someplace else. I had never rebelled. No yelling. No storming out mid-conversation. No slamming doors, no throwing things. I was the kind of person who, when hurt, would choose silence and swallow it whole. But this time, for the first time, I chose silence not out of weakness, but because it was the only form of resistance I felt worthy of the truth I had just seen. We turned the car around. Said nothing. Grant didn't need to ask what I was planning to do. He knew, from the way I gripped the wheel, from the way I didn't blink once on the entire ride back. We returned to the old neighborhood, the place I had grown up in, the place I once thought was safe. It was fully dark when we pulled up to my parents' house. The kitchen light was still on, soft and yellow as always. The scent of lavender still drifted from the porch. Nothing had changed, except me. I stepped out, feet pressing into the familiar gravel under the porch. The key was still in the same spot, beneath a fake seashell-shaped rock. I bent down, flipped the rock, and picked up the key. My hand trembled, not from fear, but because, for the first time, I wasn't entering this house as a daughter, but as an adult with a choice. I unlocked the door. Didn't turn on the lights. The house was steeped in soft darkness. I knew every step, every piece of furniture, as if my body still belonged there. But my heart no longer did. Grant followed. He didn't say anything. Just quietly placed the red duffel bag in the center of the living room. It sat there, exposed, like an accusation no one had to speak out loud. I turned around and locked the door. I didn't leave a note. No message. No explanation. Just, I wasn't taking it with me. And that was enough. We walked away, each step uncoiling a thread that had wrapped around my chest for over 30 years. You don't have to scream to sever something. Sometimes, not answering at all is the bravest thing you can do. Back at the car, I saw Grant's eyes glisten. He gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze, no words needed. Inside me were all the feelings: anger, bitterness, sorrow. But beneath them all, a lightness. Freedom. I never imagined freedom could feel this quiet. No fireworks. No banners. Just the first time in my life I chose not to obey. We left the neighborhood. I didn't look back. No need. That door had closed, both literally and metaphorically. My phone rang as we neared the hotel. It was Mom. I looked at Grant. He gave a small nod. I answered. Amelia? Her voice soft as air, sweet as always. Where's the bag? I took a breath. My heartbeat was strangely calm. I said, at your house. Where it belongs. Nothing more. I hung up first. I looked over. Grant was smiling, a small, gentle smile. We didn't need to say anything. Silence had already said it all. I squeezed his hand, and for the first time, I didn't feel like the guilty child. I felt like a mother, learning to teach by example. Maybe after we quietly returned the bag and left without a word, my family realized something was off. A kind of silence they weren't used to, so unfamiliar it unsettled them. And in my family, when logic fails, emotions become a strategy. That afternoon, I was waiting for the kids to get out of school, like I always did. The October breeze was cool, dry leaves chasing each other along the stone path. I was about to raise my hand to wave at my eldest daughter when I froze. My parents were already there, standing in the middle of the schoolyard. Mom wore a deep red velvet coat, holding a cake box in her arms, while Dad laughed and chatted with the kids. Beside them was a gift bag full of toys, a silver balloon, and 2 brand new stuffed puppies. I felt my chest tighten. My youngest jumped up with joy at the sight of the cake. The middle one plopped down on the ground, digging into the gift bag. And the eldest froze when she saw me. She didn't say anything, just glanced at her grandmother, then at me, eyes caught between 2 shores. I walked quickly toward them, but didn't say anything right away. I didn't want to cause a scene in the schoolyard. Instead, I crouched beside my youngest daughter, gently buttoned her jacket, and met my mother's gaze. She smiled brightly. I knew it was Friday. The kids like something special on Fridays. So I thought, why not surprise them? Her voice was sweet as honey. As if nothing had happened 2 days ago. As if she didn't know about the red bag, or the phone call I hung up on, or the silence I'd tried to hold as my final boundary. I squeezed my daughter's hand, then stood up, my eyes no longer avoiding hers. You didn't text me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, I didn't want to bother you. I figured you wouldn't mind, just a little treat for the kids. My dad chimed in. Chocolate cake, their favorite. And the toys, your mom picked them out all afternoon. The kids squealed in delight. The youngest had already licked frosting off the cake lid. I looked at them, and guilt washed over me like a quiet wave. They didn't know anything. All they saw were grandparents, gifts, and smiles. But I knew. I knew more clearly than ever, this wasn't love. This was emotional warfare. a sugar-wrapped bribe tied with a bow. Love isn't supposed to be a tactic. But they used it like a weapon. I knelt to meet my eldest daughter at eye level. "Sweetheart," I whispered, "I'm taking your siblings home. We already have plans today, remember?" She nodded slowly. And in her eyes, I saw something shift, like she was beginning to understand. Just a little. But enough for me not to turn back. I turned to my parents. "I'm taking the kids home. The cake, please forgive me, I won't be taking it." My mom's eyes dimmed, but her smile stayed. "I just wanted to do something nice." "I know," I cut in, gently, but firmly. "But today, the right thing is letting them come home with me." My parents stood still. The kids climbed into the car one by one. I buckled in the youngest, then got into the driver's seat. Through the rearview mirror, I saw my mother still standing there, holding the cake, watching us, not angry, not speaking, just quiet, like she was calculating her next move. And I knew this wouldn't be the last time. I drove away, my heart feeling hollow, as if I'd just lost something. But I knew if I wanted to hold on to what was right for my children, I couldn't let this saccharine manipulation blind me again. This was no longer the time for polite refusal. I needed to disappear. We had barely been home for an hour when the phone rang. Mom lit up on the screen. I glanced at Grant. He gave a small nod, then quietly took the kids upstairs. I picked up Amelia. My mother's voice was no longer sweet like it had been at the schoolyard. It was sharp, like a small pair of scissors slicing through paper. "What happened? Why would you embarrass me like that, in front of so many people?" I took a breath, trying to stay calm. "Mom, I think we need to talk." "Then come over tomorrow. 5 o'clock. I don't want to hear any excuses." Then she hung up. The next afternoon, I had Grant take the kids to the park, and I went to the old house one last time. The door opened, and the familiar scent of old wood and room spray swept over me. My mother was already at the kitchen, stirring something in a pot, eyes locked on me. My father sat at the dining table, expressionless, gripping his coffee mug like a prop rehearsed for every interrogation. I sat down. No one invited me. My mother put the spoon down, planted both hands on the table. "Who do you think you are, pulling something like that? At school, in front of grown-ups, in front of your own kids. Do you have any idea how many people saw that?" I stayed silent. My eyes didn't leave hers. "That's how you treat your own mother. Over what, a gift bag?" I swallowed hard. My hands clenched in my lap. "No, Mom," I said, voice trembling but steady. "It wasn't the bag. It was a lifetime of being treated like an afterthought. All the times I tried to be seen and was never enough." She scoffed. "Here we go again. Insecure, selfish, always blaming someone. Maybe it's just because you're a failure." I turned to my father. "And you? Did you ever hear me? Or did you just agree with her, that silence meant agreement?" He set the cup down. "We raised you, didn't we? Gave you food, school, even paid for your wedding. And now you come back to accuse us?" My mother stepped closer. "Aren't you ashamed, Amelia?" I stood up. "I've put up with this my whole life, Mom. Silent. Obedient. Swallowing everything. But today, I won't anymore." Her eyes flared. Don't you dare talk back. And before I could react, her hand flew. A slap. My cheek burned. I froze. No tears. No words. My father stood. Shook his head. You really are an ungrateful child. I turned away, still holding my cheek. The house that once held my comfort had become a place I could never return to. That night, I lay in Grant's arms. He didn't ask anything, just kissed my forehead. The next day, we started looking for a house. 9 weeks later, when the moving truck rolled to a stop in front of a small home in North Carolina, I stepped out, clutching my youngest's hand. The breeze slipped through the porch eaves, carrying the scent of fresh pine. The scent of something I'd never known before, freedom. Grant stepped out next, carrying a suitcase, softly saying, "Welcome home." I looked around. The house wasn't painted yet. The front yard was still overgrown. But no one knew we were here. No one had the right to knock on our door. No one could find us to hurt me again. We didn't leave to find peace. We left to feel safe. And for the first time, I knew we hadn't disappeared. We had escaped. 6 months later, an email popped up, the subject line in all caps, "Urgent, Rachel." I stared at the screen. My throat went dry. I clicked to open it. And the old world came knocking again. The sender's name appeared, Rachel. The subject line, all caps. "Please. Call me back. Urgent." I opened the message. Just one sentence, "Mom and Dad got arrested." I was still holding my youngest's little sweater. The scent of fabric softener was still fresh. But something inside me slipped out of rhythm, like a wrong key pressed in the song I'd been trying to play right for years. The phone rang. It was Rachel. I picked up. "Amelia, please. You have to let me explain," she said, voice hoarse, frantic, like someone who'd been crying for hours. I said nothing. I waited. They were arrested this morning. Out of state. Detained for transporting goods without papers. Might be smuggling. It's serious. I don't know what to do. I looked out to the backyard. Grant was wiping down the porch chairs. The kids were chasing each other in the sun. Their shadows stretched long across the freshly cut grass. I turned back, calm. "And what do you want from me?" "An attorney. Money. You know how to pull strings. Mom said if anyone could help, it's you." I gripped the phone tighter. My knuckles went white. "Rachel," I said slowly, "do you remember the last time I helped?" Silence. It was when I moved back near home. When I did everything to earn approval. When I kept bringing the kids over, even knowing they'd be compared. When I lowered my head and took the blame for things I never did. Just to keep the peace. My voice didn't rise. But I knew it had shifted. I helped before. Not this time. I hung up before she could respond. Not because I was angry. But because if I stayed on longer, I might have softened again. That evening, I told Grant. He didn't ask questions. Just gave a small nod, steady, like he'd been expecting this day all along. A week later, a short legal update ran in a quiet corner of the local crime section. Couple sentenced to 4 years for violation of federal transport laws. No bail granted. No names. No photos. No headlines. But to me, it was the biggest headline of my life. A line I would save, not to celebrate, but to remember. I had forgiven. I had stayed silent. I had tried to save them with the best years of my life. But this time, I don't owe them another lifetime. And that's not cruelty. That's freedom. They still call me the ungrateful daughter. I call myself a mother who knows how to protect her children. The small house nestled among North Carolina's green hills looks like nothing special from the outside. But inside, it's an entirely new world, a place where no one has to speak loudly just to be heard, where no one guards the doorway with conditions for kindness. Every morning, I hear the kids' footsteps racing across the wooden floors, the soft bubbling of the coffee pot in the kitchen, and the giggles echoing from the bathroom, reminding me of my childhood mornings, only now, I no longer have to tiptoe. I keep an old photo on my desk, a family picture taken years ago, when we all still gathered in the backyard. I had carefully torn it in half, leaving only the part with me, Grant, and the 3 kids. The rest was taken by the wind the day we moved in. Grant sleeps more soundly. I no longer jolt awake in the night. The children talk to me with eyes that no longer carry fear. No drama. No climax. Only stillness, and I've come to realize, sometimes peace doesn't come from reclaiming justice, but from stopping at the right time. I teach the kids how to bake, dust the shelves, plant a few flowers by the porch. Small things, seemingly insignificant, but each one feels like piecing back together parts of myself. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room, sunlight streaking through the curtains in warm golden lines. The youngest sat beside me, scribbling on a sheet of paper. Suddenly, she looked up and asked, "Mom, do I have grandparents?" I froze. My hand paused on a tiny knitted sweater. I turned to her, looked into those round eyes waiting for an answer. I smiled. Softly, but sincerely. "Yes, sweetheart. But you don't need to meet them to grow up well." She nodded, as if a small knot inside her had just been untangled. Then went right back to coloring, leaving me alone with the quiet. I exhaled, lighter than ever before. Not every wound needs to be healed. Some just need to be kept far away from your heart. And that's the choice I made. Not because I needed an ending, but because I didn't need a conclusion to begin living with kindness to myself and to those who truly deserve it. The snow was falling heavier when I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. I carried a cup of hot tea, setting it gently on the wooden railing now covered in a thin layer of white. Inside, Grant was helping the 2 younger kids make snowmen out of cardboard and glue. The eldest, she was journaling at the dining table, head slightly tilted, her pen never stopping. I sat down on the old rocking chair Grant had repainted just last week. Leaning back, I closed my eyes. Snow fell softly onto my hair. Images came to me, a red bag. A burning slap. A door closing without a goodbye. A small truck crossing Georgia at dawn. None of them stung anymore. But they hadn't disappeared either. I had learned not to push the past away. Only to know where it belongs, behind me. I used to be a daughter who believed that being good enough, quiet enough, patient enough, would earn me love. I used to be a woman who clung to endurance as a way to hold on to something called family. I used to think, to heal, I had to forgive. Until I saw my eldest daughter bow her head and apologize for someone else's mistake. Until I saw the middle one's eyes tense every time the phone rang. Until the youngest asked, "Mom, if Grandma and Grandpa don't love me, is it because I'm not good?" That's when I knew the one I needed to forgive wasn't them. It was me. For letting my children learn how to survive love that came with terms and conditions. A week after Rachel's call, I cleaned out the storage room. Among the old boxes, I found my college notebook where I used to write about my dream of becoming a writer, of telling stories that made people feel less alone. I opened the first page. The ink had faded. If you feel it, write it. If you heal it, share it. I looked out the small window. Snow was still falling. But inside me, the freezing had stopped. I knew I wasn't the only one carrying wounds from a family that never learned how to love well. I knew there were people watching this video, still stuck in roles they never chose. Maybe you're the child still wondering why you were never enough. The mother quietly protecting her kids from her own bloodline. The woman who once believed family must be kept at any cost. I want to say this, not from a stage, not as someone who's made it through, but from someone still learning how to live gently with herself, one day at a time. You're not selfish for stepping away from a toxic relationship, even if it's with your parents. You're not cold for choosing not to stay silent. You don't need to forgive to heal. Sometimes, healing is writing a new chapter with them no longer in it. If you've been through something similar, I hope this story offers you a little recognition. And if you feel ready, please share your story in the comments. I'll read. And I'll listen. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next healing journey. Because sometimes, what we need most isn't a hug from the past, but a community that doesn't ask us to pretend we're okay. I stood up, walked inside, and closed the door behind me. The fireplace crackled softly. Grant looked up and smiled at me. The three kids were talking over each other, showing off their half-finished snowmen. I sat down among them, gently squeezing my youngest's tiny hand. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was surviving a storm. I was living. Truly. I wasn't seeking revenge. I just stopped paying the price.